Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the library this afternoon. My name is Allison Morgan. I'm assistant director here in the library, and I'm longtime liaison to the English department from the library. So I'm always thrilled to have our English faculty do programs for us. So I want to introduce Dr. Renea Frey. She's been a friend of mine for a long time. She has just recently published a book that she has been working on for 10 years, a passion project. And I also understand she just recently won an award for the book. So I'm hoping that she will tell us about that.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I worked on this book for more than 10 years, let's be clear. But I'm pleased with how it turned out, and I'm glad that you're all here to celebrate this with me. So this is going to be a little bit outside of my typical wheelhouse. I am not somebody, for my students who have had me in class, I am not somebody who stands and talks for a half an hour straight without stopping. So this is going to be super weird for me, so I hope you will bear with me. But afterwards I will have Q&A. So how this will work is I'm going to read the beginning of the book, so you get kind of a taste of the tone and the content and the overview of the book, and then I'll do a quick PowerPoint overview of the middle, and then I will read you the end. So that's how this is going to go. All right. So we are here to talk about the theory, history, and practice of Parrhesia, the Rhetoric of Resistance, so my book, which also the library does have 2 copies, as well as digital access to it. Okay. Wait, I need glasses. Let's be realistic here. So this starts with a quote. Every society honors its living conformists and its dead troublemakers. All right. So this book is about the theory, history, and practice of Parrhesia, a type of free speech that entails frank, bold, and risky truth-telling. Parrhesia can occur as actual speech or be embedded in action, articulated through text or transmitted in a variety of expressive mediums. Parrhesia disrupts and critiques the status quo, which is why it involves danger as well as courage to enact. However, despite risks that can range from social ostracization, incarceration, or even death, the Parrhesiastes acts anyway because of deeply held values, coming from a place of needing to speak the truth regardless of the risks. Parrhesiastic acts are often not pleasing to those who witness it, but because Parrhesia arises from a place of strongly held truth claims that are often shared by the community, these acts of courage can have significant effects, both at the time that they occur and well beyond, depending upon how these moments are captured, circulated, and redeployed. While new work on Parrhesia comes out more regularly today, when I first stumbled upon the term by accident as a graduate student studying rhetoric in 2012, very little had been said beyond Foucault's lectures on the topic from near the end of his life. From the moment I saw and understood the term Parrhesia, I realized that it was the most important concept I had ever encountered, that it was, in fact, the only thing I had ever cared about, what I had been researching all along without having a name for it. With every inquiry, I became more excited. That was it. This was it, the big idea, the concept that gave people tools to undermine and shift the seemingly immovable structures of oppressive power in order to propel humanity toward a more egalitarian future. The more I looked, the more I realized that Parrhesia was an underlying part of every justice-oriented change that has occurred in human history, that it was at the foundation of a healthy democracy, and that while it operated in more covert terms during times of oppression, it would sometimes explode out from under stifling tyranny and risky acts of truth-telling and rebellion that could shake empires. Parrhesia even exists in the best friendships, the ones with people who are straightforward in their feedback, not as a bludgeon or a way to mask uncaring selfishness, but out of love and genuine concern, even when we may not be ready to hear the difficult truths they have to tell. There are different manifestations of Parrhesia depending upon the context or rhetorical situation in which it occurs. In this book, I'll talk about how these multifaceted strands of Parrhesia arose and how they have woven themselves throughout our ideology, history, and ideas of who we are. Even though we have largely stopped naming these courageous acts Parrhesia, and I will explain why along the way, we remember moments of brave audacity because we care deeply about the truths they point to. Moments of risky truth-telling matter to us because they are central to our identity and to becoming the best versions of ourselves that we can be, whether that is politically, socially, or personally. We need Parrhesia as a means of productively challenging the status quo, and yet we can barely talk about Parrhesia as a concept in itself, much less see its true effects, how it networks across time and location to undermine structures of power, eventually forcing power to shift in response. Today, when Parrhesia is mentioned at all, it is often cloaked in esoteric language, buried in a history few people read or understand, discussed by academics rather than wielded by all citizens in a healthy democracy. Parrhesia is the most capable tool for disrupting entrenched power relations, and yet it is a concept very few people can articulate or point to. Parrhesia was meant to be understood, used, and evaluated by the citizens of a democracy, and it is in that spirit that I have written this book. To make sure that I stay on track with my intentions for this book, and so readers know what to expect, I've created knowledge goals, much like I would for a syllabus when designing a course. At the end of this book, we will come back to these goals, making sure that we have covered the information I promised at the beginning. By the end of the book, readers will be able to recognize the various types of Parrhesia woven through Western history and know how, where, and when these meanings arose, grasp the complicated relationship between Parrhesia and rhetoric over time, and be able to view Parrhesia rhetorically by examining its networked effects upon audience in the moment of Parrhesia as well as across time and place, recall the history of Parrhesia and compare its manifestations to contemporary examples, articulate the conditions and effects of Parrhesia when they encounter situations of risky truth-telling, interrogate the truth claims made by those seeking to enact Parrhesia to discern the veracity of those claims, trace the networked paths of resistance across time and place to recognize the ongoing ripples of Parrhesiastic disruption across fields of power, understand the way Parrhesia is mediated by technology as circulation and distribution influence Parrhesiastic effects across time and place, and effectively enact and/or analyze Parrhesiastic actions that seek to undermine and disrupt injustice in today's world. Since I began researching Parrhesia more than a decade ago, I have been struck by how enthusiastic people become when I start describing what I study. Academics are used to blank stares and eye rolls when asked what we do, but when I mention Parrhesia and start to explain it, people are almost universally excited, regardless of whether that is at an academic conference, a public talk, or standing outside of a nightclub having a random conversation with a stranger. People are drawn to the idea of speaking truth to power, of speaking out despite risk, but packaging that idea into a text that contains its scholarly complexity and its straightforward, direct simplicity is not an easy task. While academic books are open to the complexity of an idea and an abundance of research, they are also typically written to be nearly inscrutable to a wider audience. My goal with this book is to provide a comprehensive view of the theory, history, and practice of Parrhesia, but to do so in a way that is accessible and interesting to a variety of audiences. The overarching goal of the theory, history, and practice of Parrhesia is to not only describe what Parrhesia was or is, but also to explain how to recognize, analyze, understand, and use Parrhesia in our everyday world. While Parrhesia is a concept as old as democracy itself, we do not typically talk or think about Parrhesia as Parrhesia, nor do we readily grasp its profound ability to disrupt power through its networked effects, circulating across time and place to inspire ongoing acts of risky rebellion. The theory, history, and practice of Parrhesia asks readers to learn about the tradition and meaning of Parrhesia and to participate in this ongoing practice by making the meaning of Parrhesia relevant to us here and now. I want readers to become a conscious part of the Parrhesiastic tradition, naming and analyzing Parrhesia when it occurs, noting how moments of Parrhesiastic action connect to other moments and effects, and to interrogate these moments through a critical lens, evaluating the truth claims and the ethos of the rhetors who make them. Perhaps inspired readers may even become risky truth-tellers themselves, embedding their own lives, words, and actions within this disruptive but necessary act of speaking out, which is especially important for populations who have been traditionally silenced, marginalized, or denied the equal rights upon which we claim our democracy is based. If Parrhesia interests you, then I invite you to read on, choosing your reading adventure as your interest, focus, and time constraints allow. As you read, think about Parrhesia in your life and in the world around you. Who comes to mind when you think about a risky truth teller? What values or truths does that person represent? Can you recall times you have stood up to defend an important ideal, a marginalized person, or a human right? Have you ever wanted to, but feared the consequences or felt alone in challenging the status quo? These are the questions I hope readers will ask as they read The Theory, History, and Practice of Parrhesia. The goal of this book is to make a difference in the world and to pass along or amplify a powerful tool for creating change. But before we can skillfully use a tool, we must first understand what it is, how it works, where it comes from, and how we can use it. The upcoming chapters provide readers with a user's guide to Parrhesia so that we see clearly how this tool has been with us all along, though often hidden just outside of reach in our discursive ability to name it. Okay, so that is the beginning of the book. Excerpts from the first chapter. So when I tell people that I study Parrhesia, of course, the first question everyone always asks me is, what the heck is that, right? So I've had this slide up here. This is kind of a general overview of what it is. But I am going to start the rest of this kind of summary of the rest of the book, condensing it into just a few short slides. We're going to start with the history of Parrhesia, even though in the book we actually start with the theory, but we'll start with the history. So the book discusses these three sections, or these three ideas, these different concepts in Parrhesia, but starting with the history, this goes back to ancient Athenian democracy, where so many of our other ideas come from about government, about democracy, and about free speech. So we're talking Athens, 4th and 5th century BCE. So at that time, there are ideas that arose, such as isonomia, which is the equality of all citizens before the law, isagoria, which is the ability of all citizens to have the equal right to speak, and then Parrhesia. So these are all part of like a discursive constellation of ideas that arose at the same time. Alongside these, we also have democracy, and then kind of the codification of rhetoric. It isn't that persuasion didn't exist before then, but this is where we start really seeing like rhetoric as a codified field. So all of these things arise at the same time. They kind of mutually support one another and make each other possible. So we have figures, and again, in the book, much more detail about this, but figures such as Pericles, Diogenes, and Socrates were known in the classical world as Parrhesiastes, people who spoke out, often against the wishes of the crowd. So these are some of our enactors of Parrhesia in the classical age in Athens, but then we also get thinkers, writers, philosophers who also talk about Parrhesia within this time. So these are some of the texts that I examined from that time period. So even in this first 100 years of Parrhesia, when it is really like very present in everyday public life, you already see a split into kind of the public political Parrhesia on one side. So that's where you get especially Pericles to begin with, and then later Demosthenes. This is very indicative and baked into democracy. It's one of the reasons that I think it is so important for us to understand what this is. Without citizens who have the duty to speak up when something is wrong and something is not for the good of the polis, democracy will crumble. And so it was always considered one of the cornerstones of democracy. So the risk here is a political risk and sometimes then a bodily risk. We often don't think about sort of the danger of speaking before a very violent crowd in saying something they don't want to hear, but that is more how politics worked. Athens, certainly in Rome, which I think we're a little bit more familiar with the violence kind of inherent or risk there. But this is the goal of bettering the society, of bettering the polis. Over on the private side, you have more Platonic and philosophical Parrhesia. This can exist in both a democracy or an autocracy. So it exists in both places. This is more seen in interpersonal relationships, friendships, and in small communities. So some of the small philosophic communities. So this is where you get the value of a true friend over a flatterer. Someone who will tell you the truth versus somebody who will just tell you what you want to hear. So this is for the goal of bettering the self or the community. And we can see Plato and then later Plutarch and Philodemus for examples of this. So going on with that split, This is another split that you see here, and one of the things, I'm not going to read it, but I do have a whole section in here called What About Foucault? Because this is what Foucault was working on at the end of his life. He never wrote a book about Parrhesia, but he did several lectures. And right as I started to research this, his last lectures had finally been translated into English so that I could read them. Now, one of the places that I disagree with Foucault is in his assessment of what rhetoric is and contains. So there has been, and I could give a whole talk about this sort of split between rhetoric on one side and philosophy on the other. So you've got the political, the rhetorical, the public over here, and then you've got the private philosophical interactions over here. And a lot of his sources and his ideas about rhetoric come from reading Plato, who had a very particular set of ideas about what rhetoric was. He was not a fan, let's just put it that way. And so then when Foucault comes around, he kind of amplifies those ideas of this split. If you study how the interactions between rhetoric and philosophy, I do this because they have been seen as polar opposites. They've been seen as more or less the same thing. It has gone over these last 3,000 years. There have been many, many differences of opinions on these relationships. So this is one of the places where I break with Foucault, despite what I consider very, very important foundational work. All right, so here is a fun little graphic. This is a genealogy of Parrhesia throughout the ancient world. So on I guess that's your left, on your left, this is how this worked in ancient Athens. So we have kind of the public political, the philosophical, and what I show here are places where those connections, where it is a genealogy. These are this person influenced this person, versus where there are some tensions. So where you see the dotted lines, that's where there are tensions, there are disagreements. You can see Diogenes here in the middle. I wish I could just talk to you about Diogenes of Sinope all day because he is awesome, but then this goes down off the page and over to the other column. You see how this kind of jumps. The idea of Parrhesia sort of jumps over to the Roman Republic. It is looked at, it is read about, it is translated, but in Latin there is not a word that means Parrhesia exactly. So in these translations you will see either Parrhesia translated as libertas, so liberty, like that, and you're like, yes, like the civic duty and liberty, this idea there, or it's translated as licentia. So that's where you get words like, for us, licentious. It is an overabundance of talking. And there's this wonderful word in Greek that I can't recall the exact pronunciation of that literally means a mouth without a door, which is someone who just talks on and on and on because they have the legal right to do so. And so there are problems with Parrhesia. I also want to make that clear. Even within the first 100 years, there are people who mimic Parrhesia, who pretend to be bold and straightforward because people valorize that, but they're really self-serving and they're not actually doing things for the good of the polis. There were some problems. Not everyone had access to it. What defined a citizen was fairly narrow in Athens. So this is not, it's not ideal, but this is where the idea comes from. The last part of the book, where I look at the history, the classical history, is looking at the end of the Roman Empire, or the Republic as it slides into empire, and then the first few hundred years after that. So again, you see this kind of tracing of this genealogy, and how this then comes down to early Christian thought. So in the Greek version of the Bible, some form of Parrhesia is present 41 times. And so this is something that was talked about and something that was part of thinking in the vernacular at that point, but only in Greek. So the issue comes when you start looking at other languages. So this is some of what I mean. And to be clear, this then goes down through all of Western history from that point. So I do trace that through there, but there are kind of repeating patterns of what happens to Parrhesia throughout the next several centuries, and I talk about that in the book but I will not give you all those details at this time. But looking at this is kind of what I mean when I say a networked rhetorical theory of Parrhesia. As one of the things that struck me in my research was that when you would read one person who was associated with Parrhesia, they would so often cite people from the past. Well, here I am, I'm Demosthenes. Boy, when things were great when Pericles was here, now I'm Cicero. Now let's look back to Demosthenes. So there is this influence that you can see, this networked effect of Parrhesiastes. And some of this, it's what I kind of trace out in this network effect, that I think it is not just the moment of Parrhesiastic action that is important, but it is how that continues to spread. And so that is a lot of what I look at in this networked rhetorical theory. All right, so I am going to zoom in now. So again, this is using Parrhesia to create a rhetorical theory. So for anybody who has been in composition or rhetoric, or for those of you who teach it, you have seen this triangle. We often talk about rhetorical situations, and one of the things that I recognize with Parrhesia is that it is a very specific rhetorical situation in which Parrhesia arises. So you have a particular, so I'm going to start with the center. So the center of this action are these values and ideals that are kind of things that give a culture its identity. And I mean big ideas like equality, liberty, justice, freedom, autonomy, things like that. And so that's where this starts, is that kind of central meaning and ideology. And then the exigence is usually something is violating that. There is some place where that's not what's really happening in the real world, and it creates this tension. So the Parrhesiastic actor acts in whatever way they do. One of the constraints there is that the person acting always has less power than whatever it is that they're critiquing, whatever they're standing up against. So it is a punching up kind of action, where you're standing up to something that is much more powerful than you. Audience tends to have a very wide range of responses. This is not pleasing to most people. It is very awkward when someone goes totally outside of bounds of social norms to say something or do something. So in the moment, it's often very uncomfortable for audience members, but then you have this whole range of identification, valorization, you go girl, that kind of thing on one side, all the way to that's unacceptable, this person should go to jail or die. So that's the risk. That's the kind of continuum there of risk and the way that audiences respond. Kairos, this often interrupts something. Like there is a tendency in many of these interruptions, life is going on, status quo is rolling along, the Parrhesiastes comes up and interrupts that. So there are like specific cases of literal interruptions in some of the things that I analyze. Also, the delivery tends to be very blunt, very straightforward, sometimes unpleasingly so, sometimes uncomfortably so for audiences. So I'm going to give you a very short example. I have 10 case studies in my novel here. Novel, ha. Ha. In my book. That's next, yes. So I'm wearing my favorite quote from Rosa Parks. I went to the museum, her museum in Montgomery, Alabama, just a few weeks ago. So this is like a brief rhetorical analysis, like that the rhetorical situation for Rosa Parks refusing to get up when she was told to on the bus in Montgomery, all these many years ago. So you can see obviously she has less power than the institution she's standing up against. People were, I've read accounts of it, people were very uncomfortable. People got off the bus, they're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be part of this. There were people who were really inspired. I mean, obviously it inspired the entire Montgomery bus boycott, which changed laws. But then there was also the other end of that. Like she was badly criticized in public. She lost her job. There was a lot of violence and backlash from these actions. So this is kind of like a simple rhetorical analysis, a Parrhesiastic rhetorical analysis that shows how these things look in a more concrete way. Now, when I talk about the networked effects, so if you look in the center there, there's the little red square. This is kind of just a generic networked effect. A lot of times people seem to be acting alone. So Rosa Parks didn't get on the bus that day and they all had a plan and she's gonna do this thing, but there was this whole network of people around her, and then since then that has allowed this to continue to ripple on. And if you read her words and the things that inspired her, you see her look to the past and the people who inspired her. You see the other actors and collaborators who were around her at the time, who were actually waiting for a good test case to take this to court. So those are also collaborators in this. And then this thing happens, and here, you know, the ethos of the Parrhesiastes is the strongest rhetorical appeal in all of this. So the person has to have a very strong ethos, but of course that varies by audience. So there's not one kind of person that can do this. But she was, you know, the pictures of her, like with her, what do you call it, the numbers, when they take your picture?
Yeah.
Yes. Mugshot, with her mugshot, thank you, and the pictures. And she looks like this nice lady with her little hair in a bun, and she's being arrested. And so this circulates. So part of this too is circulation. It's one of the reasons that, like for instance, we know about Cicero because he wrote down his speeches. We know what he thought, we know what he said, we know what he did because he wrote it down. And so this is always mediated by technology, and the way that this spreads is mediated by technology. So of course today, things are instant. You know, Bree Newsom climbs the flagpole and pulls down the Confederate battle flag, and it is online instantly. So today those kinds of things happen much more quickly, and we hear about it more quickly. Therefore, it has a lot more ability to ripple through the culture more quickly. But of course, with that also comes like other means of oppression that we're also all aware of. All right, so kind of the way that I see this, and let's see if this will work, is that this model, it zooms in and you look at the situation itself, this Parrhesiastic rhetorical situation, and that itself is one way of interrogating and analyzing these moments, but then zooming out and seeing how that locks in all of these other ways with other Parrhesiastic actions, that's actually, to me, the real power of Parrhesia. It doesn't really matter if it works in that moment. And that's one of the things that people often get down about. They're like, well, yeah, this person stood up and they did this thing, but what did it matter? Because, you know, it didn't change anything. Or did it? And that's kind of what I look at is, well, yes, every time something like that happens, it empowers other people to take those steps as well. And you see that in the kinds of actions that we remember today. Those people, when you drill down into, well, what inspired you, a lot of times it's the people in the past who stood up to oppression, and that emboldens other people to do it as well. So the moment itself matters, but I think it's the ongoing way that it travels across time and place that is the real power of Parrhesia. So this is the last little diagram that I will show you. How Parrhesia disrupts power. So if you, again, look in the center there and you see these values and social ideas and truth claims as kind of being the center, that is what the person is like. I care about this value, this ideal so much that I am willing to go to jail for it. I'm willing to die for it. So that's in the center. But then when you actually see this field of conventional social practice around it, it's like, well, we claim that we value equality and freedom, but how is that actually playing out in practice in this field that we see in front of us? And so what the Parrhesiastes does is speaks from the center against these violations. And in doing that, the way that I envision it is it creates these cracks and fissures in that field. And eventually, with enough cracks and fissures, power has to realign and rearrange itself to take that into account. And sort of my life's work is that I would like every single person to be able to see those moments and go, that's Parrhesia, that's Parrhesia, that's Parrhesia, that's Parrhesia. Oh wow, those are all connected, and look at what it's doing in the world. Because when you put them all together cumulatively, it's way bigger than just that one person doing that one thing, that one time, that maybe didn't work in that moment. So to me, it is the resistance is much stronger. than the oppression is over time. So as I read the last bit of my book here, I'm going to leave you with my favorite Foucault quote up there before I read the final chapter. So I'm doing that terrible thing where I'm like, oh, I'm telling you how it ends. But thank heavens it's not a novel, or you'd be really mad at me right now. Okay, the courage to listen, discernment before action. If there is one knowledge goal I may have skimped on, it is part of the final one, to, quote, effectively enact parrhesiastic actions that seek to undermine and disrupt injustice in today's world, which I will address here as we near the end. First, enacting parrhesia is risky and typically incurs a continuum of consequences depending upon the action involved, the practice or institution challenged, and a host of other exigencies and constraints. This is not something that I would encourage lightly or indiscriminately, as the repercussions from a parrhesiastic moment can be life-altering or even life-ending. It would be irresponsible to embolden others without also reiterating the risks. No one can tell others what perils they should undertake. That is an act of conscience and discernment beyond the scope of this work. Additionally, as described in Chapter 8, ascertaining the veracity of truth claims and the motivational ethos of the speaker is a complex process, but failing to do so can lead to disruptive acts that do not serve a greater good and might instead only further systemic abuses of power. Enacting parrhesia is risky, both because it disrupts the status quo, which always comes with consequences, but also because the ethos of the parrhesiastes is at the heart of this activity. Parrhesia is not self-serving, and in fact often creates significant hardships for the parrhesiastes, but the courage to act despite risk is not enough. Parrhesia contains a central element of ethical interrogation and reflection that is impossible to address in a single textual work. The theory, history, and practice of parrhesia does not advocate for an abandonment of social institutions or a future where all is chaos and anarchy, as that kind of state would lead to oppression of those without access to power just as surely as the most centralized tyranny. As Foucault reminds us, power is inescapable. It will exist regardless of how we order and reorder our world, societies, and institutions, a condition we must be mindful of, lest we haphazardly destroy the foundations of power rather than shifting them to become more inclusive. Instead, the theory, history, and practice of parrhesia asks readers to consider how parrhesia, standing up in service of the values we collectively claim to hold and demanding that we actually enact those values, might serve a larger good over time by including those who have been traditionally and systemically excluded from power. To do that work requires understanding large systems of power and how to shift them, but also demands a truth-based reflection on our own shortcomings, selfishness, and exclusionary behaviors, both as individuals and as a society. This is one of the many reasons that I believe it is important to understand parrhesia as both a public/political and private/interpersonal act. For readers to have the kind of ethos necessary to enact parrhesia in the public sphere to truly serve their communities, they must also be willing to enact parrhesia in their private lives as well. Just as the philosophical enclaves in the ancient world practiced parrhesia with one another as necessary for the betterment of self and community, even when that truth was unwelcome or difficult to hear, so too must we do the hard work of seeing ourselves individually and collectively as we really are. Acknowledging our shortcomings and how shaped by discriminatory power dynamics, we must undertake the labor necessary to rectify the inequalities, bias, prejudice, exclusion, greed, and egotistical self-absorption we find within ourselves. Parrhesiastic actors are desperately needed to speak out against the many wrongs in the world and stand against forces of oppression. But that work must be undertaken with care, reflection, and the ability to also hear difficult truths, lest we blindly perpetuate the very oppression we hope to eradicate. We can recognize interpersonal acts of parrhesia on a social level as people who have been traditionally marginalized call out others for their racism, sexism, violence, and oppression. But we can also see how not ready for those truths many who have traditionally held power are. This is also where the everyday person can enact parrhesia, not only by calling out oppression in their everyday lives, but by listening fully to those who have been on the painful end of power dynamics, sometimes for centuries. We must hear the truths that others have to tell, in addition to being truth tellers ourselves, and to acknowledge the risks taken to speak out. This is the difficult work of Parrhesia, one that shifts the foundations of the self, altering our self-perceptions and cherished ideas of who we are in ways that are often difficult to hear. However, for power to shift to enact our most venerated ideals of equality, safety, fairness, freedom, and autonomy, we must be willing to do the work of changing ourselves too. If we want to embody the courageous ethos of the Parrhesiastes who serves a community beyond the self, with a devotion to those ideals that runs so deep they are willing to sacrifice their own safety to do so, we must hear what the marginalized have to say to ensure that we act for the good of all. We must have the courage to hear as well as speak, to listen as well as act, if we are to optimize the networked effects of Parrhesia to create a future that is less oppressive and more inclusive than the past. Parrhesia, moving forward after looking back. The study of rhetorical Parrhesia points toward a rich future of analysis where risky acts of truth-telling might be viewed across time and location in ways that more fully elucidate their power to alter embedded hierarchies, oppression, and marginalization. The potential sites of analysis are too numerous to count, but given the risks Parrhesiastic rhetors have taken throughout our history and how their courage has worked to enact social change, it behooves us to understand how Parrhesia works rhetorically, both as an analytic tool and as a method of effectively disrupting entrenched power structures. The theory, history, and practice of Parrhesia has also examined the various ways that Parrhesia is mediated by technology, so that the way that Parrhesia is enacted, distributed, and circulated has changed across time. Unlike the ways Parrhesia circulated in the classical age, today's digital environments allow the networked effects of Parrhesia to travel faster, intensify, and circulate more widely, which points to the growing importance of understanding the effects of Parrhesia as we move forward into an uncertain but highly interconnected future. New modes of digital communication offer extended possibilities for both oppression and resistance, where wide-scale and potentially oppressive surveillance lurks behind the reliance on digital communication networks, but so does the ability for marginalized groups to circulate Parrhesiastic messages to wider audiences and create significant political and social change. By theorizing Parrhesia through a networked rhetorical lens, we have the ability to interpret Parrhesiastic acts as they occur, as well as to intentionally guide moments of resistance to effectively challenge oppressive systems of power. The effects of risky moments of resistance, undertaken for centuries by untold myriad Parrhesiastes, has yet to be fully theorized or even widely named. Articulating these acts of truth-telling for what they are, Parrhesia, is an integral step toward a future that recognizes, understands, and intentionally implements outspoken resistance to subjugation and inequality wherever it arises. Through recognizing and effectively applying Parrhesia, even the marginalized have a chance to interrupt and reform power, constructing new systems with the potential for greater inclusion and alignment with the deeply held ideals and truth claims that we valorize and yet largely fail to manifest. While acknowledging Parrhesia for the powerful tool it is will not automatically nor easily generate a more equitable future, articulating its possibilities allows students to strategize and speak out, even at great risk, when doing so is in the best interest of the overall well-being of the community. The values of Parrhesia are embedded in our history from the roots of Western civilization, never fully realized yet always covertly influencing ideals of courage, truth, and the drive to resist oppression despite risk. By recovering this history and applying it to current social and political situations, we likewise reclaim the means to advance democratic principles and greater inclusion in the workings of power, tools that are more needed than ever in times of global crisis and growing inequalities. This was the promise of Parrhesia at its inception within Athenian democracy, and one that we must now realize if we are to promote a more egalitarian future for all members of our world community, especially the most silenced and at risk. Thank you.